the Kinos essentially is mostly from Eliezer Kalir. Most of the piyuts, most of the things that we say during the Kinos is from Eliezer Kalir. And then there's also parts that we speak about the Crusades and about the burning of the Gemaras in France. Talk a little about history. So there's a principle that's brought down in this Miyit and Roishi Mayim Ve'en Mekar Noizli, which is one of the Kinos that speaks about the Crusades. And it says over there that one of the reasons why we mention a few times, we also mentioned Nadir Torah, Azar Lavon Nadir Torah. We talk about the Asar Rugim Malchus, and we mentioned Asar Rugim Malchus twice in the year, on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. These are twice that we mentioned it. The Asar Rugim Malchus it's not found in Chazal. There's nowhere in Gemara that says there's Asar Rugim Malchus, that there are 10 martyrs. The Gemara says there, Bekiva v'chaveirav. Some say that's an allusion to that idea, that there were 10 that were killed during, and Asar Rugim Malchus. If you read the story in the Kinos, it looks like they all were killed. In Kiddush Hashem, they were killed the same time period, right? It looks like they were all lined up, especially the way it's said in Yom Kippur. The way we say in Kinos on Tisha B'Av, it's a little bit different. Also, the order is a little bit different. Some of the people are a little different. But in Yom Kippur, it sounds like Tira B'Shmal Asatzma, the famous story. And B'Shmal, they came, and there was a decree, and they decreed for the 10 to die, to be killed. But they weren't actually killed in the exact same time. It's over almost a 100-year period. Some were killed. Some of the Gedolei Yisrael were killed at the end, towards the end of Bayis Sheni. Some were later. Some were almost 50 years later by the Bar Kochba revolt, like Rabbi Akiva, Kiyadua. So this is different. This is Adrian, different king, different time period. So we speak about the Gedolei Yisrael, and so there's two issues over here that Misasan Shel Tzadikim, that the death of Tzadikim is Shkula Keserfis Beis Elokeinu. It's just like the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And also that it brings kaparas, that it brings atonement. So that's why we speak about it on Yom Kippur, for the atonement part of it, for kapara. And on Tisha B'Av, because it's Gedolei Keserfis Beis Elokeinu. So this happened over a long period of time. And also the Crusades did not happen during Tisha B'Av. There's a remnant that we have even today, that a lot of the things happened during the months of Sivan, correct? Also Tach V'Tat, which we also talk about in 1648 and 1649, Chmielewski. The reason why they're all put together is because of this phrase that we have in the Kinos, that the Kinos says that what we do is we put all the tragedies in Jewish history are all linked to Tisha B'Av. Not only they're symbolically linked, this is actually something that came up after the Holocaust, that there were certain people that wanted to create like a Yom Tainus, a special day to commemorate 6 million Kedoshim, and all the Gedolei Yisrael were against it. And the reason why, and that's why we don't do it. There's no special day. There's no special mark day for Tainus or to say Kinos or to mark it, because they said everything has to go back into Tisha B'Av, because that's the way we mourn. We put everything into Tisha B'Av. And the reason for that is because Tisha B'Av is essentially the root of all the problems. That's the root of all Gullus, is the Churban Abayis. So we're living out Gullus throughout thousands of years, but this all originates from the Churban, from the original destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. And that's why we're remembering it still today, because we still have the effects. We're not remembering just something that happened in the past. We didn't build Beis Hamikdash is not being built in our times. It's a continuation of this Churban. So we have, we mentioned a lot of different events, and this is very formal, by the way. I don't know, because the camera makes it very formal. So there's a lot of different things that we mentioned. So go through some of the parts of the Kinos. So first we have to figure out who Elazar Kalir is. We spoke about it in the past, but who is Elazar Kalir? Because most of the piyutim, most of the Kinos comes from Elazar Kalir. There was and it's obviously, if you read the Kinos, you'll see that it jumps from the first Beis Hamikdash to the second Beis Hamikdash. It's not chronological. It doesn't start and say, the Kinos, the first Beis Hamikdash, and then the second Beis Hamikdash, and then the Churbanos that happened later in Europe. It jumps around. But a lot of them are written by Elazar Kalir. So during the second Beis Hamikdash, towards the end by the Churban Bayis Sheni, which was through Titus. So there was one of the generals in the Galil, one of the Jewish generals, defected, became a Roman. We don't really have a good understanding why this happened, but then his name was Yeshivas, or Yosifun. That's the way it's called. That's the way it's called. And he wrote a history. He became Roman. He went with the Romans. Chazal have a interesting perspective on this character. In Shulchan Aruch, it's brought down in Hilchos Shabbos whether you're allowed to read you're not allowed to read on Shabbos. I know people do this, but officially you're not allowed to read newspapers and things like that. Familiar with this? You're not allowed to read these things. I know there's a lot of people go out of business if we say this, but this is the way it is. So in Halacha, the Beis Hamikdash brings down whether you're allowed to read this book called Yosifun. And the Poskim write that you're allowed to. There are also rules like this, Shulchan Aruch, because Dvarim sheyesh bo Yireh Shamayim. There's things that have Yireh Shamayim in the Sefer. Most people think that Yosifus and Yosifun are the same Sefer. It's actually not. So you just know that. There's Yosifus in English, and there's Yosifun. Yosifun sounds like the same book like Yosifus, which was written by, like I said, a Jewish general that lived at the end of the Zman HaChurban, and then eventually moved to Rome, and was commissioned to write by the Roman Emperor. Was commissioned to write a book, a history of Jews. The Frum version is called Yosifun. It's a separate book. We don't really know who wrote this book. Yosifun is a book based on Yosifus. So when you see we're in Chazal, wherever, in Pasuk, when it speaks about the book Yosifun, it's not Yosifus. It's a different version. But in Yosifus, it actually brings down that Titus said, B'zman HaChurban, when he came to Yerushalayim to destroy the second Beis Hamikdash, or to conquer the land, it's more accurate. He didn't really come to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. He said that if he waits long enough, he sees that the Jews are such infighting between the Jews, that if he waits long enough, the Jews will self-destroy themselves. He doesn't have to wait. But which is a very big. Whether he said it or not it's not relevant, but it's something to think about. That sinis is chinam. That's what This is the whole Gemara in Gittin talks about this, about the Churban Bayis Sheni, all became called sinis chinam, senseless, baseless hate. This is definitely something that we have to think about when we sit on Tisha B'Av, how we can create avas chinam instead of sinas chinam. To make sure that the building, if the Churban Bayis came because of sinas chinam, then the building of the Beis Hamikdash will come because of avas chinam. Okay. So where did we begin? Elazar Kalir. So Elazar Kalir, Tosis writes. By the way, this is not a share or a lecture. You can, if you have ideas, please share. Ask. Tosis writes in Chagiga that Rabbi Elazar Kalir is Rabbi Elazar ben Reb Shimon, which means he's the son of the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So Rabbi Elazar Kalir is a Tana, according to the Balei Tosfos. Tosfos quotes Elazar Kalir a few times in Tosfos, La Halacha, or at least to think that the piyutim are very serious. The Tosfos Rosh Hashanah talks about the machlokes between Elazar and Yeshua when was Nivra Olam. And Tosfos says that to reconcile, because in Elazar Kalir in the Python it says such and such, so therefore we have to reconcile these two opinions. This is Shidduch HaTosfos. Most Rishonim, certainly the Achronim, say that that's Lim Istaber. It's not. It doesn't line up to say that. Maybe there's another Elazar Kalir, but the Elazar Kalir that we know about that wrote these piyutim lived in Eretz Yisrael about, let's say, 400 years after the Churban, 400 or 500 years after the Churban. What was going on in Eretz Yisrael 400 or 500 years after the Churban? Does anyone have an idea what was going on? What was going on in Klal Yisrael 500 years after the Churban? So this, let's say, 500 years after the Churban is after what we call Chasimus HaShas, right? So the Chasimus HaShas is, let's say right after the Chasimus HaShas, let's say in the fifth century. What was going on with Klal Yisrael in the 5th century? Anyone have an idea? So if you say you lived the 1st century, so the 1st century still, the Churban was in the 70, the Common Era. So the 1st century was most Klal Yisrael lived in Eretz Yisrael. Some after the Churban by Yisishon already started living in the Bavel, right? That's this whole story of the Megillah. not all of Klal Yisrael went up with Elias Ezra. A lot of Klal Yisrael stayed in Golus. This is what Ezra complains a lot. So, but a lot did. So you're talking about Bizman of right after the Shas, right? Or the Gemara is still happening maybe in Bavel, but it's Chasibus HaShas of Yerushalmi. So after the Chasibus HaShas of the Yerushalmi. So if you're familiar, the Yerushalmi is completed before the Bavli, a few hundred years before the Bavli. The Bavli continues much later. Why did the Yerushalmi come to an abrupt ending? What happened at that time period? And what actually happened after that time period? So after the Zman HaChurban, most of this, the Gemara already says this, that after the telling Yam v'Chachama, that most of and after already where the Sanhedrin was complete in Yerushalayim was closed, most Jews moved to the Galil, to Tveria, to the area of Tveria. We call Tzafon, or the north. That's why if you go to Kvarim today, and you see Kvarim of the Tanoim that in Eretz Yisrael, to the Kvarim of the Amoraim, you never find them in Yerushalayim. How come they're not in Yerushalayim? Why are they not? That's where the Beis Hamikdash is. Why are they not in Yerushalayim? Because after Yerushalayim was Nechrav, most Jews moved to north, moved to the Galil, to Tveria. You ever heard this? The Rambam writes this Messiah that the Sanhedrin will nechser, that the Sanhedrin will return back to Tveria first. Why would it come to Tveria first? To the Tzafon. Why? Because that's where the last place of the Sanhedrin was. The Sanhedrin was Gola 10 times, but once it was left in Yerushalayim, then it went from one place to place, and ended up in Tzafon. So the Romans ruled out Yisrael then, right? A lot of the Jews were living then in what we call Persia or Iraq, that area in the world. And that's where the Gemara was. That's where it was a flourishing Gemara, Yeshivas. Surah, Pumpedisa, the big Yeshivas, Rav Shmuel, the big Yeshivas in Bavel. In Eretz Yisrael, in the Galil, so the Romans were in control of Eretz Yisrael, and at a certain time period, the Romans converted to Nazareth, and they became Christian. They adopted this religion as Christianity, as their religion. Which is interesting, by the way, just a side note, that before that, 10% of the Roman elites were Jewish. It's a real number. Pshat is that they weren't Jewish the way you think that people are Jewish. So Pshat is they weren't mamash halachically Jewish, but they thought they were Jewish. And a lot of, even the Roman Emperor, Nero's wife, considered herself Jewish. You know, there's a tradition in Chazal that Nero became a Yid, right? That he was Mizgaya. There's a famous story in Gemara. There was a lot of Roman people that they used to go to shul. I don't know what shul exactly looked like, but they used to go to shul on Shabbos. They were not eating, but they considered themselves part of Klal Yisrael. And there was even a debate, maybe to create that Judaism should become the religion of the Roman Empire. Obviously, it didn't work. First of all, it didn't work because Abishai didn't want it to work. That's number one. That's the sibas. That's the cause of the cause. And the simple reason is because to be a frum Yid, you have to do bris, you have to do Shabbos, you have to do kosher. It's not so easy. So you're going to tell a whole population to do that. It was impossible. Once the Roman Empire became Christian, they became tremendously anti-Semitic against Jews. As much as they were before, they became 100 times more. And there was a lot of persecution in Eretz Yisrael. And the persecution reaches a very, very high point where all the yeshivas closed. And that's the Chesimus or Talmud Yishalmi. That's what happened. Eretz Yisrael, the Yiddishkeit was squashed. They didn't allow Eden to learn. It was an issur to learn Torah. There was like prohibited. You didn't have Yeshivas. And but there were Yidden that survived there. So what did the Jews do there in Eretz Yisrael? In Bavel, there was still a flourishing Talmud Bavli. In Eretz Yisrael, you couldn't learn Torah. Some people couldn't move to Bavel. So what did you do? The Romans allowed Jews to daven. That they allowed to congregate and to daven. So they had shuls. Lately they found shuls in the Galil. I don't know if you're familiar. Like the last few years, they're finding like these ancient shuls from 2,000 years ago in the Galil. At least it looks like a shul. You could look at it. It's clearly it's a shul. So what do Yidden do? So they created a version of an interesting thing. They became piyutim, which is that they wrote poetry. You're allowed to chant poetry. The Romans didn't have a problem with the poetry. But what they did with the poetry is every Shabbos there was some very famous piyutim, like Elazar Kalir or Yanai and some of the bigger piyutim, and they would release every Shabbos like a piyut that should be said in shul. Let's say it's Parshas Bereshis, right? But you can't read Parshas Bereshis. You're not allowed to read the Torah, but you could read the poem, and you're not allowed to learn Torah. So they wrote these poems that are full of Chazal. It's basically telling the story of Bereshis in a poetic way, loaded with full of midrashim and gemaras and Chazal. So like this, people continued to learn, even though officially they weren't learning; they were just reciting poetry. And the top one of this whole group was Elazar Kalir. He was the most sophisticated one. The Even Ezra, who lived many years later, writes that Elazar Kalir's poetry is too dense. No, you have to be a huge Talmud Chacham to understand what he's saying. You have to know all the midrashim. You have to know what he's saying because everything's an illusion. That's what poetry is. So it's very complicated. But we have these are a lot of the poems that we have are from Elazar Kalir. If you're familiar a little with Chazal, you'll see that this is full. It's full of Chazal, but it's very encrypted, very hidden. So this is what was happening in Eretz Yisrael. These piyutim. So what he does is what he does is he uses Eicha, because that's the main text. Eicha was written by Yirmiyahu Navi. The Gemara says Nashutvim. And he uses the psukim of Eicha to wove together, speaking about the Churban itself, of the Churban Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, and events that happen throughout Jewish history, and also events that were happening during his time. One of the big things that happened during his time, like I said, there was a lot of persecution, was also that there was mishmaris, right? You're familiar with Kohanim, there was mishmaris. They have to have all the mishmaris. David Melech was masakin. That there were 24 mishmaris, which means there was a mishmar kohen that you belonged to a family, and you served in the Beis Hamikdash twice a year. Married twice a year, so it's 48 weeks. So twice a year. If you belonged to a mishmar, everyone knew which mishmar you belonged to for that week. Let's say you were the house of this family, you knew that you were this mishmar. After the Churban Bayis Sheni, for hundreds of years, the mishmaris still knew which mishmar they were. They said, this family is this mishmar, this week and this week. For hundreds of years, they used to also fast. They used to do this. They used to have minhagim to keep up the memory of the Beis Hamikdash, that they used to have the mishmaris. Bisman of Elazar Kalir, that's when that thing started falling apart because of persecution. People started forgetting about it. So he also speaks about in the Kinos. He speaks about this, the loss of the Kohanim, the mishmaris, that they forgot where they're coming from. So here you have the story of Arzel Avon Yoter is the Torah. He said this is something that happens over a long period of time. Well, so if you look at Eicha, let me see. Okay. In Eicha, so there's 5 prakim in Eicha, right? There's 5 prakim in Eicha, and they follow the Aleph Beis, right? Aleph Beis Gimel, Perek Aleph, Eicha, Balchei Sipcha, same thing goes to Perek Beis. But Perek Beis and Perek Gimel and Daled, but Gimel is already 3 psukim for each of the Aleph Beis. There's a difference in Perek Beis Gimel and Daled, is that the pei comes before the ayin. So Perek Aleph is Chav Beis Oisis, Chav Beis psukim, this 24 psukim, and it's ayin, Al Eila Ani Bachia, then Perek Shatzi Yadeh. But in Perek Beis, it's Patzo Alayich PM, and then As Hashem. It's reversed. It's pei, then ayin. It's Daled. Same thing also in Daled. Hey, Perek Hey, is Chav Beis. There's 22 psukim in Perek Hey of Eicha, but it's not in the order of the Aleph Beis. Okay. Also in Perek Daled, Eicha Yuam Zav, he says, the Navi says continuously, Ruach HaPeinach Mashiach Hashem Nilke B'Shechis Nafel Teres Yishenu Oyana Mayadlanu. Who's Teres Yishenu? Who is Mashiach Hashem? Ruach HaPeinach Mashiach Hashem. Who's the Mashiach Hashem that died? And who is Nafel Teres Yishenu? You're talking about a person. In Perek Aleph Beis and Gimel, yeah, we're talking about the Beis Hamikdash that's destroyed. But in Perek Daled, we're talking about a person. Something happened. Who died? Who was killed? What happened then? And why in Perek Hey is the Aleph Beis? It's 20 psukim, but it's not in the order of the Aleph Beis. So the Medrash says that this is talking about Yoshia Melech. that Yirmiyah Hanavi lived through the Churban Bayis Rishon. And Yirmiyah Hanavi had the sad job of telling Klal Yisrael that there's going to be a Churban, that the Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed. If you ever look at the Sefer Yirmiyah, you'll see that there were other Nevi'im, like Hanani ben Azor, Nevi'ah Sheker, that said that the Beis HaMikdash is not going to be destroyed. Everything will be fine. And there was Chizkiyahu, the king Chizkiyahu, which was one of the great kings of Klal Yisrael. Chizkiyahu was, the Gemara says that Hashem, the Gemara says in Sahel that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that Chizkiyahu is Mashiach, that Abishah wanted Chizkiyahu to be Mashiach, which means Chizkiyahu was a big tzaddik. The Gemara says in Brachas, in the beginning of Brachas, that Chizkiyahu didn't want to have children because he knew that he's going to have Rishayim, that things are not going to work out from his children. And the Gemara says Hadu Kafshim Rachman and Lamalach, and he have to have children. But he has children like Menashe and the other ones that come out of him that are not so great and did a lot of problems. But then there was a melech called Yeshiyahu. Yeshiyahu, or Yoshia, was a melech he was a king. This is in this Eicha on page 25. Eicha Eli Yikarinim Elo ben Shmoyna Shana Helcha Lidrish Melekav is talking about Melech Yoshia. He became a king when he was younger, when he was 8 years old, and he was a big tzaddik. He's the one that found that rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash was during Zman Menashe, and afterwards there was a lot of Avodah Zarah in Eretz Yisrael, and people didn't go up to Beis HaMikdash. It was not. People didn't use it, and he's the one that cleaned it up. And he famously found the Sefer Torah. You're familiar with the story? There's a famous story in Tanakh that he finds the Sefer Torah, and it's a big deal, and it's open to the Teichacha. And then he does a big sukkahs. The first year he makes a very big sukkahs. People stopped keeping sukkahs, and he said they started keeping sukkahs again. And at that point, the Babylonians and the Egyptians, between Egypt and Babylon, or between Iraq and Egypt, is Eretz Yisrael. This is all this strip of land. Right? Egypt is already in Africa. You go to the other direction, you go to Iraq, Iran, etc., right? Syria. The Egyptians and the Babylonians, the Egyptians used to be a very powerful kingdom, then the Babylonians became a powerful kingdom, and they're always fighting with each other. So the Egyptians told the king, Yoshia, that they wish to go do battle against the Babylonians, and they want to pass through Eretz Yisrael, to get through Eretz Yisrael. Being that he was a big tzaddik, and he upheld, and apparently he turned the people around in a good way. He says, that there's a pasuk that says that when Klal Yisrael is in a good place, there's no sword would pass through Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, he told the king of Mitzrayim, he told him that no, you can't go through Eretz Yisrael. Remember, Israel was a tiny little country, and it was acting very, very strong. But and Yirmiyah Hanavi told the king, you have to let Mitzrayim go. You have to let the Egyptian pass through. And he said, no, what do you mean? We're very righteous and we're big tzaddikim. Nothing's going to happen to us, and they're not going to be able to enter into Eretz Yisrael. And sadly, he put on his armor and he went to battle. When the Egyptians heard that they're not allowing them to go to Eretz Yisrael, they didn't come to Eretz Yisrael peacefully. They went through to conquer the land, and then to get to Nebuchadnezzar, to get to Bavel. And he was killed in battle. Terribly killed. This is Eicha speaks about this. He was pierced with 70 arrows. And on this, Yirmiyahu Hanavi speaks about an Eicha Yom Zav, that the gold is melted, and Mashiach Hashem died. And this is really the beginning of the Churban. And the Medrash says the reason why the Perek Hay has 22 psukim, but it's not in the Seder of the Aleph Beis, is because Seder Aleph Beis means that everything is ordered and structured. Like you can think straight. And so the 22 corresponds to the 22 years from when Yeshua was nifter, was killed, until the Churban Bayis, Churban Bayis Rishon, until the actual Churban. So it was 22 years afterwards. Then it was Sitkiyah and Yocham. Those are the final kings of Klal Yisrael, and that's when the Churban happened. And also, so the Medrash says the 22 correspond to 22 years, and also because the 22 means that that when a person is mavulvel, a person cannot count straight. You can't say Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Your head is not so correct because you're in a state of stress. So that's why Yirmiyah does his 22 psukim, but not in the order of the Aleph Beis, because this represents the beginning of the destruction. If you know a little bit of history from what happened in the Zman Churban Bayis Rishon, that's exactly what happened. The Mitzrim basically, the Egyptians basically kept on telling the Yidden afterwards that if you go to battle against the Babylonians, we're going to back you. They were a powerful army. The Jews are a small army. And all the Nevi'ah, a sheker, were convincing the kings that was a good idea, the kings of Israel, that you can beat the Babylonians. The Babylonians, be'emes, were not really interested in destroying the Beis HaMikdash. Certainly not the Romans. If the Romans were not interested in destroying. The Beis HaMikdash was destroyed physically. It was actually destroyed. The physical Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, but the Romans never destroyed buildings. Fakert. What the Romans used to do is, like a lot of ancient civilizations, what they would do is they would conquer a land and take whatever buildings they have and transform for their own purposes. Why would you destroy a building? It's a beautiful building. You'd make it into something else. So and Yosifun, that character, writes that they had no desire to destroy the Beis HaMikdash, which actually makes sense. And it was a flare, it was a fire that caught onto paroichas or something, caught onto something, and it caught fire, and that's how the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. But it was not intentional. And the time the Romans realized that it was such a big fire, they said, forget it, let's just keep the fire going and it'll destroy it. But that was that original intention. The Maral brings this down and says, it could be true it wasn't intentional. He says, but min hatoiv yotza toiv, people that are good do good things. People that are not so good do not such good things. You say maybe they didn't have an intention to do negative, okay, but the fact that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by their hand means that they were not such good people. So anyways, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and then eventually the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and now we're sitting still in Galus.
The second one was intentional.
The second was
intentional. The second one, they bring down the story.
Josephus speaks about with regards to the second Beis HaMikdash.
Oh, the second one.
Yeah, Titus. Yeah.
The whole thing was going into his sword, into the breakfast.
That's correct. So that's afterwards. So that's the story that he became upset, and he did it despite. Yes, that's the famous story. And then he gets a bug in his, or some type of bacteria in his brain. It becomes a bird, like a copper bird. Yeah. So there's two churbanos. There's a churban Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, and they also represent two major. I mean, besides the fact that it's a churban, they also represent two major shifts in Jewish history, which is after the churban Bayis Rishon. Basically, by the end of the Churban Bayis Rishon, that's when Pascha Nevuah ends, prophecy ends. Nevuah continues a little bit, like Chagas, Chaim, Malachai, like Soifa Nevi'im, like that's the beginning of the Zman Bayis Sheni. But they're small, like minor Nevi'im. The the last of the Nevi'im that we have from the Gdolim of the Nevi'im, from the great of the Nevi'im, is Yecheskel. So Yirmiyah, Yeshayahu, this is all the final Nevi'im. Yecheskel is already lives in Bavel. Amaras Bavel Sham Yishavnu is a Nevuah Yecheskel. So Yecheskel's already went out into from Eretz Yisrael, went to Bavel. But Nevuah is connected to Eretz Yisrael specifically. There's a day in the Chazal that you can't have Nevuah Chutz La'aretz. You can only have Nevuah in Eretz Yisrael. And then the Medrash asks, but L'chura Yecheskel does have Nevuah. That Amaras Bavel, he has Nevuahs that are outside Eretz Yisrael. So he says, A, he came from Eretz Yisrael, and B, means he's from Eretz Yisrael, and secondly, he's talking about Nevuahs that are connected to Eretz Yisrael. So it's a continuation of Eretz Yisrael. But once Klal Yisrael stopped living predominantly in Eretz Yisrael, that's after B'chur and Bayis Rishon, that's when Pascha Nevuah, that's the end of Nevuah. Towards the beginning of the Azman Bayis Sheni, is the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh really starts the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the revealing of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the way we understand it, is really the story of Purim, which happens between the first base of Mikdash and the second base of Mikdash, right? So the story of Purim is between the two bases of Mikdash. And that's a Hadar Kiblu b'Mei Achashverosh. There was a new Kabbalah Torah, a receiving of the Torah. That receiving of the Torah is the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's what the Gemara calls it the Chiddush. The Gemara says that in Shavuos, the Gemara says that Dvarim Mischadshim, one of the things that are Mischadish is Mikra Megillah. That's a new thing. Of course, that Kol Masha Tam Vasel Chadish is Nitn Moshe Sinai, but there's a new idea, a new revealing. And what's the first new revealing of Torah Sheba'al Peh? Which means a halacha, a day that we celebrate based on not on nevuah, not on prophecy. Didn't come Torah B'Ksav. Wasn't a prophecy. Is Purim. That's the beginning. That's Aschala. That's the beginning of that. In the language of Chazal, the Gemara says in Yuma that Ayalas HaShachar, that Purim is Soif Kol HaNisim. It's the end of the miracle period. So, the time in Nevuah is a time of miracles. That it's a Gilul L'Kos. It's a revealing of a higher light, and that's why there was the miracles in the Beis Hamikdash, and there was you had the Urim V'Tumim, and you had all the things that brought Nevuah, which did not come back in the second Beis Hamikdash. We're only in the first Beis Hamikdash. That was the time of Nevuah. And Nevuah, what does Nevuah mean? Nevuah means that we had a capacity, the Nevi'im had a capacity, to bring down a Shef Eliki, to bring down the divine light, and to give clarity. If you don't know what to do, you go to the Navi. And what does the Navi tell you? The Navi says, "I'll find out. I need to know. You need to go to battle. So I'll ask the Urim V'Tumim. I'll ask, and it'll be revealed." What exactly the Urim V'Tumim is Machlekes Rishonim. If the Urim V'Tumim is actually, Rashi writes as a name. It's in the Choshen, they put a little name of the Shem HaForesh, but the Rambam doesn't hold it. The Rambam holds that it's actually the Choshen itself. It's not a separate thing. It's not Urim V'Tumim is a separate. There's no little paper that had the name of Hashem. The Choshen itself was the Urim V'Tumim. When in Zman Bayis Rishon, the first Beis Hamikdash, it functioned. Like the Kohen Gadol was able to ask when Urim V'Tumim was able to ask if we should go to Melchama Yetz or not, and then you had to ask the Urim V'Tumim. God, the Rambam also holds, which is a huge chiddush, that the Kohen Gadol used to be nichnas into Kodesh HaKadoshim when he used to ask the Urim V'Tumim. So besides the fact that he used to go on Yom Kippur, which we know, and the other time that people used to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Gemara says they used to go to clean. They used to go from the roof to clean the right. They had to be clean once in a while. So janitors used to go, but they used to go from the top. But it looks like there was another time that actually the Kohen Gadol would go in to ask, when they used to ask if you should go to war, he would actually go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which is a chiddush. But that whole world of Nevuah came to an end. And Nevuah was not just that there were Nevi'im, because Chazal say there were 48 Nevi'im, the Gemara says Megillah. They had a certain amount of Nevi'im, the Nevi'us. The Nevi'im was actually, there was Keflaim Kiyotzim Mitzrayim. that there was 600,000, so there's 1,000,002 Nevi'im during a period. So you know how long from leaving Mitzrayim to the Churban Bayis Rishon? Do you know how long the time period was? How close? How much? No. What are you for? That's the Beis Hamikdash. Yeah. How long is the whole time? 800 and 850. 850. The Nishantam. So it's Rashi writes, right? So Nishantam is 850. So which means over 300 years, 375 years. Yeah. And Noiv is 40 years. Yeah. It was a long time. It was 480 years after we left Mitzrayim was the building of the Beis Hamikdash by Yeshivas. Then you take out 40 years because that's the Zman HaMidbar, right? And plus 410 from the Beis Hamikdash, so you get 450. 850, exactly. You get 850. So you're talking about for 850 years. Let's minus the 40 years in the Midbar, so it's 850 years in total. That in this 850 years total, there was Kaflaim Kiyotze Mitzrayim. There was 1,000,002 Nevi'im. There's a Medrash Shir Hashirim says that for every Navi there was a Nevi'ah. There was a woman, a female prophetess. So you're talking about 2.5 million people that were Nevi'im. Then there's something that's called Bnei Nevi'im, right? The Bnei Nevi'im is the Rambam brings down. I think it was Mikdash. That at the end he says that there was. It says that they wore this ephod, they wore this type of garment. It says that anyone that was a Bnei Nevi'im, which means someone that's practicing to become a Navi, used to dress differently. What's a Bnei Nevi'im? Bnei Nevi'im, like what today we call Yeshiva Bacher. So when you're in Yeshiva Bacher, today you're sitting and learning Gemara. But what do you do before you learn Gemara? It's Mana Tanakh. You're learning to become a Navi. That's that way you're trained to become a Navi. Some Nevi'im that we know, the famous Nevi'im, that's called Nevi'im L'Doros. Only Nevuah L'Doros was written down, which means there were millions of Nevi'im that said prophecy, but it was not relevant to L'Doros. It was relevant for that period of time. So let's assume there were 2.5 million Nevi'im that actually became Nevi'im. We can assume that at least half of them did not become Nevi'im. So you talk about 5 million people in 800 years. You're talking about a large percentage of Klal Yisrael were trying or involved in Nevuah. Nevuah was a thing that you did. Okay, so what's Nevuah? Nevuah means is a whole long conversation, but let's use the Rambam's version. Exactly. Yeah, but the truth is, but Nevuah is actually quite little. It's one opinion. That's okay. So that's the interesting about Nevuah. Nevuah, you don't have machlokes. It's what Hashem said. There's no. It's an important distinction over here because it is actually one opinion. That was the whole chiddush of Nevuah. Every navi misnav b'signan echad, right? Every navi has to do it and live their own little way of seeing it, but what comes down has to be the same thing. When the Gemara says, like the difference between, let's say, Yecheskel and Yeshayahu, because if Yecheskel, you look in the Nevuah Yecheskel, it's full of, he sees all the malachim and he sees Ma'aseh Merkava. You look in Yeshaya, Koyam Hashem, there's nothing, he doesn't talk about anything. So the Gemara says that Yecheskel is a ben kvar. He's like a dweller. Kvar is like a village kid. A doubtful kid. So he comes to the king. He sees wonderful things. He starts talking about, you know what I saw in the palace? I saw gold, silver, and Yeshaya was a ben krach. He saw these things every day. When he comes to the king, he's not so impressed that he saw gold and jewelry and carpets. So he doesn't talk about those things. Yecheskel talks about he saw malachim and he saw Merkava. Yeshaya sees this every day. He's not so impressed. Which means they both saw the same thing, but they saw it differently. So that's important. That's the distinction of the Nevuah. God, that same Gemara in Megillah and that speaks about the Nevuah says about Yirmi and which is Mana Churban. So Yirmi was very tough, which means Yirmi has told people the way mirrors. That's what his name means. Mirror, it comes from bitter. Yirmi is told that there's going to be a Churban. There were Nevi'im running around and saying, no, there's not going to be a Churban. Everything's going to be fine. You're very powerful, which seems to be a very good message, right? Don't worry, the mitzvah are going to protect you. We're going to fight the Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to be Jew. We're strong. We're holy. We're powerful. And Yirmiyah is like the guy, the doomsday. He's saying, no, things are not going to work out. I'm telling you, call yourself. Things you better shape up. It's not going to. So the Gemara says that there was Yirmiyah's niece, was called Chulda Neviah. So Chulda Neviah was a woman. So the Gemara says that when Klal Yisrael wanted to ask a question, they didn't want to go to Yirmiyah, because Yirmiyah always tell them very harsh. So they used to go to Chulda Neviah. Because Nashim Rachmani Yasem. The Gemara says because women are more compassionate. If you need a question, if you ask Chulda Neviah, you're going to go to the harsh prophet, you're going to go to the gentle woman over there that's giving nice prophecy. So the question is, or maybe Ben Gabbai in Avodas Kodesh asks a question. It says, if it's Nevuah, what's the difference who says it? I understand. If it's the word of Hashem, you come to Yirmiyah, you come to Chulda. They're not making it up. They're saying what the word of Hashem is. He says it's true, but it depends how you say it. The Abisha says that, let's say it says this is what has to come through, but you can say it. By the way, this is what's going to happen. By the way, this is going to happen. You said the same thing, but if you say it one way, it can be very kind. You're a terrible guy. You're a terrible guy. Different conversation. So Chulda Neviah was able to say it b'rachman. The words had to come through. She was rachmana, so she was able to say it in a different way. But Nevuah, as a whole, comes to a close. In general, it's not mamish like strict Nevuah comes to a close. Nevuah that we understood in that time. But there's Balei Rishonim. They were called Nevi'im. The Balei Atosis, they were called Nevi'im. There's a sefer from Ravu Magalis, Malachi Asharis, I think. There's an introduction, a whole arichas, where you see in Rishonim, where they quote from some of the Rishonim, they call them Nevi'im. So what Nevuah means exactly is complicated, but the general idea of Nevuah ends with the Cheskel. So Cheskel is the final from the big Nevi'im. And that's Zman Churban Bayis Rishon. Let's go to now what happens is Man Bayis Sheni. Bayis Sheni is the beginning of the revealing of Torah Shabbat Peh, which is at the beginning of Purim. And then, if you look at Mishnayos, in Pirkei you'll see the Moshe Kibbutz Torah Messina, it's the first Mishnah of Avos, which gives the transmission of Torah Shabbat Peh. Moshe Kibbutz Torah Messina, Mesar Yeshua, Skein Nevi'im, Mesul Anshei Knesset Agdola. Right, so there's another Masrua, there's another Mesira, there's another transmission. Moshe Kibbutz Torah Messinai, then he gives it to Yeshua is Skein Nevi'im. That's all one Mesira, that's one transmission. And then Nevi'im Masrua Anshei Knesset Agdola. There's a new Masrua, there's a new transmission, which means that the Torah is now going from Torah Shebiksav, Tanakh, from Nevuah, it's going into Torah Shabbat Peh. Okay. The rise of Torah Shabbat Peh happens during the revealing of Torah Shabbat Peh happens during the Bayis Sheni period. When specifically the next Mishnah that says in Pirkei Avos, what's the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avos? Or third, Shimon HaTzadik? Yeah. Shimon HaTzadik says, Shimon HaTzadik is the first, Hu HaYomer? Yeah. So Shimon HaTzadik is the beginning of revealing. There's a Chazal. There's a Tana. I don't know if it's Shimon HaTzadik or Tana, but the beginning of the Tanoim, right? That's the first one that we know. Shimon HaTzadik lives right in the middle of the Zman Bayis Sheni. In the middle of the Zman Bayis Sheni period. Shimon HaTzadik, the Gemara says that Shimon HaTzadik meets Alexander Mukdam, Alexander the Great. The famous story that he comes out and he's dressed and Alexander Mukdam bows down in front of him, right? And he says that he sees his image when he goes to war. Alexander the Great, which Chazal accepted as a very good person. In fact, and you didn't have names Alexander because of that. Ready for thousands of years. It's a non-Jewish name, but you didn't name their kids Alexander to name them after him. So Alexander the Great conquers Babylon, conquers the Persian Empire, which the Persian Empire is the story of Purim. That's when the Persian Empire was powerful. Then Alexander the Great conquers Persia, conquers everything, conquers Egypt, conquers Israel, conquers most of the ancient world. During Alexander the Great's, there's parallels here that happen. The Gemara also says that the Yitzer Avodah Zarah, the Gemara says Yom Samachtas, that Yitzer Avodah Zarah, the Yitzhahara of Avodah Zarah, was destroyed. That we don't have the Yitzhahara of Avodah Zarah. Right? No one has an Avodah Zarah. No one walks like, oh, no, really, I should really be worshiping the tree. It's not like a thing. Maybe today a little different, but this is not such a common thing. So Yitzhak Avodah Zarah was put away. Now the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah ends in the same time period. The Gra writes and the Tzaddik writes in the same time period. It's also historically you can see this at the same time period when Nevuah ends. Nevuah ends, and the Yitzhak of Avodah Zarah ends. That same time period. Something else rises up in the world. What comes into this world is Torah Sheba'al Peh, which are parallel to that. What happens now in the world is that the world goes into a different mindset, a different way of thinking, because of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had a teacher called Aristotle. You ever heard of Aristotle? Okay. Chazal call him Aristo. The Rambam holds that he's cardinal of Nevuah. So he was a very brilliant person. There are other issues, but he was a brilliant person for sure. And Aristotle is he's the father of modern philosophy, which means before Aristotle, before this period in history, people did not think rationally about things, empirically. In other words, if you want to understand something, you have an idea, but it doesn't have to be empirically true. It doesn't have to be verifiable. If you want to say that the anatomy of the body is, if you lived like before Aristotle, you'll say the anatomy of the body is that people have 100 teeth. Because 100 is a good number, it's a summation of teeth. But no one actually counted the teeth to see that there's no 100 teeth. Because that's not the game. It's not the question. The idea makes sense that you have, that you have 100 teeth. And Aristotle said, if you really want to know how a person's anatomy is, open a person's body and look at it. Like, see, here's the heart, here's the brain. Actually, do things physically, empirically. So Aristotle was the first rationalist philosopher. Okay, that was his chiddush. This created a new shift in the entire world because Alexander the Great conquered most of the world. So people moved away from one way of being into another way of being, which means they moved away from Avodah Zarah to rationalism. In the Torah, which is Stakel Be'Raisa Baralmas, the Torah is the root of everything, which means that you see the same parallel. It's the source of that, is that we're moving away from Nevuah to Torah Sheba'al Peh. What's the difference between Chazal and a Navi? It's very, very simple. In the Navi, in order for the Navi to know the truth, you have to stop thinking. The Rambam holds that there's three opinions about Nevuah, and one opinion is that Nevuah is the peak of rationalism, the highest level of intellect is Nevuah. One understanding is Nevuah is that is completely has nothing to do with your brain or your rational brain, has nothing to do with it. And the Rambam says the correct opinion is that Nevuah is you reach the highest level of intelligence, in your own capacity to understand, and then there's a ruach milmayla that comes, there's a shef milmayla that comes down, which means ultimately Nevuah is you're preparing yourself to receive something that's beyond you. Ein Nevuah chal, it has to be a chacham and an asher and a gibor. Right? The chaloisa Nevuah, the Nevuah to happen, is for a person to be an asher, a person to be rich. But it doesn't mean that because you're rich, you're a navi. And the chaloisa Nevuah is a person has to be a chacham. But not because you're a chacham, you're wise, you have Nevuah. The chaloisa Nevuah comes when a person's like this. This is what happens, the Nevuah comes down. So Nevuah is like Mamayla Lamata, like from above to below, it's like a Ruach Nevuah. Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is Chazal, is literally the opposite. Torah's Chazal is that you have to go Milmata L'mayla. Milmata L'mayla means you have to work through your seichel, through your intelligence, to figure something out. The Rambam in the Akdama Amar Nevuchim says that Nevuah is like when you walk into a dark room and you'll flip on the lights. That's Nevuah. It's dark, you turn on the lights are clear. What is Chazal? Chazal, we say this in the Eichel, the Machshakim B'Shivani, right? That the Yirmiyahu says that we went to Machshakim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu put us in the place of darkness. Where's the place of darkness? It's Bavel. The Gemara calls Bavel a place of darkness. But the Gemara also says in Sanhedrin that Machshakim v'Shivani is Zu Talmud Bavel. That the Gemara is Machshakim v'Shivani. Why is the Gemara called Choshech? Why is it Machshakim v'Shivani? So the Medrash Tanchuma Noach says that Ha'am Cholchem b'Choshech v'Ro Or Gadol Zu Talmud Bavli. That a nation that walks in darkness and then finds light, that's the Gemara. Because what is Gemara? Gemara means that you don't understand something. There's a question. You harve, you have Yigia. You try to figure it out. And finally you get to clarity. The clarity is brought through Choshech, through a question. Something bothers you, right? If you learn Gemara and you don't have a question, it means you don't understand. Right? If you're learning, I don't difficult. There's nothing happens. To me, obviously, you're not understanding what you say. Yeah, if you learn Lagir, so if you learn a little bit, you say, "This is a steer to this. This makes sense to this. What's the Havamim? What's the Maskana?" Then, so the more you magea in the question, that brings you to the bigger light. Then you say, that's the Svara. So Chazal is through Choshech coming to Or, through the below coming to the light. Versus Nevuah is the opposite. It's the Or that comes down and becomes revealed. Right? That's the difference between the period of Nevuah and the period of Chazal. Now, in Chazal itself, in the flourishing of developing, the revealing of Torah Sheba'al Peh, there's also two periods. There's the first period of revealing of Torah Sheba'al Peh, where there were no machlokes. I couldn't say there were no machlokes. The Gemara says there are three machlokes. About smicha and other things, there were three basic machlokes. But other than that, there were really no machlokes, which means people had different opinions, but eventually they came to a resolution together. The Gemara says that Bizban Hillel v'Shammai, that the Talmidim weren't Meshamer Rabim Kol Tzarkom, is here b'machlokes b'Yisrael. Then it became a lot of machlokes. When people weren't receiving the Messiah correctly, there was a problem that was that there was a lot of different machlokes, a lot of different opinions. And Torah Nasa K'Shnei Torahs, Chas v'Shalom, that the Torah became like two Torahs. This guy says this is B'Shammai says like this, B'Shalom says like this. When you look at the Churban Bayis Rishon, the Churban Bayis Rishon is the Churban of the destruction or the ending of Nevuah. That's that time period. The Churban Bayis Sheni is the destruction of Torah Sheba'al Peh itself. The Torah Sheba'al Peh goes into Golus. Torah Sheba'al Peh itself goes into Golus. What happens after Churban Bayis Sheni? And this happens, and that's why we'll see when you think about what the Kinos is about, and it talks about all these Churbanos that happen, all these destructions that happen, is throughout history. Once we were no longer by the second base of Mikdash in a certain place, and Jews were dispersed throughout the entire world, Nasa K'Shnei Torahs, which means there were Yidden that lived, let's say, in Spain, and Yidden that lived in Morocco or in Algeria. They had very little communication between each other. So there were different. The Torah took on a different surah in each place. It took on a different type of form. If you were a German Jew versus a Yemenite Jew, okay, you both put on tefillin. Right? Obviously, the Torah Sheba'al part of it was very clear. But in terms of minhagim, and in terms of dress, and in terms of speech, in terms of things, it became splintered. There was a splintering of Torah. That's even the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Even the Torah itself went into Golus. Then the Golus of Torah was the destruction of this idea that it was no longer centralized, and it was broken apart. It lasted. It's interesting that if you think about this in terms of, really when this developed, once there was destruction of Torah as Eretz Yisrael, and then the Torah moved to Bavel, which is that the big yeshivas in times of let's say the 6, 7, 8, 900s, where were the big yeshivas? All the big yeshivas were in Bavel. That's where the big yeshivas were. The goyim, that was yeshivas. There were no big yeshivas. There were not even small yeshivas in the rest of the world that we know of. in the 900s or 800s. There was nothing. Everything was in Bavel. So let's say you were born. Let's say you were born in England, and you wanted to learn. You have to go to Bavel. If you were born in Spain, you have to go to Bavel. The Goyim, there was originally the yeshivas of Surah and Pumbedisa were actually in Surah and Pumbedisa, but over time, Surah and Pumbedisa became unlivable. These are little tiny towns. You can imagine Surah and Pumbedisa like this major. It was like Montebello, Muncie. It was a little place. They moved to Baghdad. Everyone moved to Baghdad. The big yeshivas moved to Baghdad. Yeshiva doesn't mean what we think also yeshiva. We think of yeshiva as that people sat in one building the entire day and sat and learned. That didn't exist. What meant that you belonged to yeshiva is when the yeshivas moved to Bavel, and the head of the yeshiva is called the God. The Rosh Yeshiva was called the Goy. That's where we have the word Goy from. So the head was called the Goy. Goy Yaakov. Actually, it doesn't actually mean genius. We today mean God. Somehow mean genius, but Goren originally meant like the pride of Israel. Goren Yaakov, like he was Rosh Yeshiva. He was like the pride of the yeshiva. The yeshiva in Bavel, the yeshivas in Iraq was like this. That they had a building probably the size of this room, not bigger. I doubt bigger. And they had a yachikala, which means that 2-3 times a year, the Bachrim would come to the yeshiva. They would rent a space. They would actually rent a big space. You can have, there's a sefer called by Reb Nosson HaBavli. Reb Nosson HaBavli, you say in the morning, you say the Nosson HaBavli Emer? Yeah? Not that Nosson HaBavli, that's from the Zman Gemara. There's another Nosson HaBavli later, Nosson, that comes from Bavel. But his name is Nosson HaBavli. He wrote a book that survived, that actually explains what happened in the times of the Goyim. He lived in the Zman Goyim, and he explains what happened. And he explains that what happens was the Bachrim would come for Yachikala. The Bachrim would sit in the front. The Rosh Yeshiva would give a shir. This would go on for like a week or so. All the Balabatim, whoever wanted, would come and observe it. There was like an observation. They would rent a big space. The Bachrim would come. They would sit in different pews, different rows. The front row, less. That's like they used to be done. The Rosh Yeshiva would give let's say they were learning Baba Basra. So the Rosh Yeshiva would give like 10 shirim of the Baba Basra to start them off. The bigger crowd were able to see. They were able to see the Bachrim engage with the Rosh Yeshiva. Then, after the Archikala, the Bachrim would go to the little towns. Everyone would go to their own little city. So they would go all over Bavel, wherever they lived. And they sat and learned together as a chavrusa in their basement together, 2 guys. And then, by the next Yachikal, they wrote down all their questions and everything that they were dealing. They came back to the yeshiva, and the yeshiva gave another yeshiva and dealt with their questions they had for the last 6 months or 8 months. And that's what the yeshiva was. They didn't actually sit in one place and have food and svarim. That was not the situation. But this is the way yeshivas existed for many years. And there was always 2 yeshivas. There was always two yeshivas in Goyim. They were called Surah Pumbedisa. They weren't actually Surah Pumbedisa, but they were called those yeshivas, or Shiva, the Gon of Surah Gon Pumbedisa. This went on until, the later ones that we know famously is Shmuel Chafni Goin, Reb Hai Gon, Reb Shira Goin. They're all, Hai Gon is the son of Reb Shira Gon. That's the latest spot of the Goinim. That's the end part of the Goinim. Also interesting, by the way, that the Goinim were all from Bavel. In order to be a Gon, even if you were very brilliant, you came from another place, you weren't able to become the Rosh Yeshiva. It's like some type of nepotism. You have to be part of the only Gon we know that's not from Babylon, that's not from Bavel, is Reb Sadia Gon, who's one of the famous ones. Reb Sadia Gon is Egyptian. And Reb Sadia Gon was such a big genius that they decided to make him a Gon. There was a huge machlekes against it, and he had a lot of tzaras in this. But he ended up being a Gon in Bavel. But that's the final end of the period of the garden. What happened then is that the Jews lived in Spain. Spain was considered the furthest part of the world in the Roman period, that was the edge of the world. Spain was the edge of the world. If you know a little bit of the map, right? So if you imagine you didn't know about America, you didn't know about the whole world. So the edge of Europe, the furthest part of Europe, is Spain. So in Zman Churban Bayis, some say Rishon, but it's probably close to probably Sheni. Zman Churban Bayis Sheni, the Romans took hundreds, thousands, we don't know the number, many Jews, multiple Jews, and shipped them to Spain. So this is like the first century. This is like 2,000 years ago. The reason why the Romans shipped the Jews to Spain, it's kind of unfortunately, maybe true, but unfortunate, is because Jews were good with numbers and money. This is a problem that Jews have since thousands of years. So they were good with calculations and money. So why did the Romans send the Jews? Because they needed people to collect taxes and to figure out how much money people owe, percentage, how much you're making, and also to keep cheshbon. So you need cheshbon and money. You need people to figure this out. So they said the Jews are actually good at this. So they sent them to Rome. They sent them to Spain. In Barcelona today, there's a shul. If you ever go to Barcelona, which is fascinating, there's a house of the Rajba. You ever went to the Barcelona? They have the Rajba's house. The Rajba's house is like a side note. The Rajba was also a very wealthy man. He was a banker. The Rajba, I don't have to say what the Rajba was. The Rajba was from the Gedolei Rishonim. The Rajba was a very powerful person, also very powerful person. The king of Spain, of Aragon, actually gave the Rajba permission to, if he wants, to put people to death if he needs to. Like he had the permission to kill you. If there was something going on, and he didn't have to go to the local authorities. The king gave him permission. Because of that, the Rajba actually suffered also from, people didn't like this so much. He was Karvel Malchus. The Rajba, it's written, we know this, that the Rajba, when he sometimes traveled out of Barcelona to other Jewish communities, he would travel with the royal protection. So Spanish guards, security of the king would come greet him, which was very chashuv. I mean, that's if you think about it at that time. The Rashba was also very wealthy. He was a banker. I don't know how the Rashba did everything. They once asked the Friedrich Rebbe, the Rayatz, who Yossi is named after. They once asked the Rayatz, if you look at the Rashba's life, you'll see that it's not human for what he did. He wrote a tremendous amount of things, thousands of tshuvas, and he wrote a crazy amount, more than anybody. And he was a busy person, and he was a Rosh, he was a Dayan, and he did business. So how do you do it? So the Rayatz says that if you're a Mesuder, you can manage. If when you do one thing, you're doing it fully, you can manage. The problem with people can't do so many things because they're doing one thing, but their mind's thinking about the other thing. So then you're not doing anything. If you're learning, learn. That's it. Put away your phone, learn mamish, you're going to be successful. When you're doing business, do business. Don't start saying, this reminds me of this Gemara, because it's not going to work. Whatever you're doing, do it fully. I'm not saying you shouldn't write a Gemara. I'm saying don't occupy what you're doing in your mind. When you daven fully, you're able to daven. Kitzur, the Rashba, so the Rashba had a porch on his house, which is a chiddush. He had a house, he had a porch. So the porch was used for dates. That if you need to go to a date, if you lived 890 years ago, what do you do? Where do people go to dates now? You go to a hotel lobby, I don't know, you go to the airport, I don't know what people do. There's places to go. But if you live in 1,000 years, where are you going to go? Everyone's going to see you. You're going to walk into the streets. You can't go to your father. Where are you going to go? The Rajba had a porch. So they used to date on the Rajba's porch. But imagine going to the rabbi to date on his porch. It's also a problem. But that's what it was. The Rajba was a rich man. He had a porch. You can see the porch today. This is the porch of the Rajba. The Rajba's porch, right across the porch, which was the Jewish quarter, they found, 30 years ago, they found a shul from 2,000 years ago, or 1,800 years ago. This is from the first Jews that settled after Churban Bayis Sheni. It's a small little space, it's underground. I mean, underground. It wasn't underground, 2,000 years ago, but it got, lower and lower. And it's a full shul. You can see there's an arm, there's the place that they davened thousands of years ago. So Jews went to Spain thousands of years ago. And we know this. There's the Visigoths. There was many different periods of Jewish history. But if you were a Jew and you had money, and Jews had money in Spain, They became very wealthy, some of them, very quickly. They were taxed by the Goinim in Bavel to give money. Which means that was the yeshiva.
Now I know how we do like that.
It's the same thing. Yeah, exactly. It's going back hundreds of years, this problem. They were taxed by the Goinim in Bavel to send money to help the yeshivas. That's the way the yeshivas survived. And there was you had to give the tax. It was like, you had to pay up. And it was a sliding scale where everyone gave more money, and you had to send them to the yeshivas. There's a famous story in Shashalas HaKabbalah, which is not, it's a legend, but let's say some of it is part of it is kind of true. You ever heard about the 4 people that were captured, that were the 4 Gdolei Yisrael that were on a boat and they were ransomed? Ever heard the story?
No.
Oh, okay. So there's a famous story that how did Torah get into Europe? Because everything was in Bavel. Is that there were 4 Gdolei Yisrael on a boat. One was the Ben Hananel, Shmuel, the Ben Hananel's father. One was Chanech ben Moshe ben Chanoich. There was 5 Gdolei Yisrael, and they were ransomed. One was ransomed in not Algeria, in Jabra, in Yemen. Where's Jabra? In Tunisia. One was in Tunisia. Koran was a big yeshiva, and one was in Spain, and one was in England. That's the Besoya. Whether this is true or not, we're not really sure, because it's one of these one of these stories that we tell. It could be true, maybe, but in the 900s, 1000s, the Jews then in Spain were very, very wealthy, and they started becoming very powerful. Ibn Shaprut was one of the very, very powerful Jews then. If you go to Granada in Spain, there's Alhambra. There's a famous, right there. There's a palace. In the middle of the palace, there's a water fountain that has faces of lions, and the water is coming out. You see it? Okay. That water fountain was from Ibn Shaprut. It was his gift to the Sultan, and you still see it today. And it's actually there's inscriptions. You can see that he did 12 shvatim. He did all these Jewish things. He was a very wealthy man. They built Granada. The Jews built it. It actually used to be called Jewish City or something. The Jews were very powerful. Okay, now the Jews have money and they're very successful. We have to start opening yeshivas. So they tried. The money. They thought with money you can buy a Rosh Yeshiva, but it didn't work because you needed Talmid Chacham. You need people that really know how to learn. In Cordova, in the 1000s, there was a Yid that showed up called Moshe ben Chanoich. That's what they call him. The Beis Yosef quotes him. A lot of the Svarim Paskim quote him. Or Moshe ben Chanoich. Chanoich ben Moshe, that's the son. Him and the son. They were very low-key people. They didn't come from Spain. And somehow the people started talking to him and realized he's like Gdolei Yisrael. These are the real deal. So this Ibn Shaprut opened the yeshiva and made them the Rosh Yeshivas. And that's when the yeshiva started taking off, which means that the Bochum, young kids, Svardish kids living in Spain, didn't have to travel all the way to Baghdad. Now they can learn in the local yeshivas. The yeshiva became very popular. It became so popular that they moved the yeshiva to Luceno. Luceno, it's kedai to go there once. It's a tiny little town in Spain. It was. I don't know if you use the right definition, but let's say it was like the Lakewood of the 1000s. It was a town that was. It's the only town in Spain. It's a town in Spain that was built around the yeshiva. All cities in Spain, Lahavdil, are built around a church because that's the Goyim came first. They built a church and they built a city around it. This town was built around the yeshiva. The yeshiva came, a very popular yeshiva, had a lot of money. There was a lot of backing from Jews, and they built this yeshiva. The first famous Rosh Yeshiva in this town was the Rif, no less. The Rif is the Rif, right? One of the great. So the Rif is not from Spain either. He's from North Africa. But they brought the Rif over. He came when he was in the 50s. They brought the Rif over, and he became the Rosh Yeshiva. The Rif was the Rosh Yeshiva there. The Rimagash was the Talmud of the Rif, who's the Rebbe of the Rambam's father. The Rambam writes Moiri on the Rimagash. When the Rambam writes on the Sefer, whenever he writes Moiri, it's the Rimagash. The Rambam actually didn't learn in Luceno. He was very young. He was a boy. But his father, Maimon, was a Talmud in the yeshiva, and was a Talmud of Rimagash. Rabbi Yehuda Levi, which you're going to read Leitzia and all this, all the piyutim from Yehuda Levi, was a Talmud of the Rimigosh in Luceno. So this was the major yeshiva. This is a major yeshiva. Nevin Ezra learned there. All the Gdolim lived and learned in this yeshiva. I've told you this in the past, but it's fascinating. They found a few years ago, like 20 years ago, they were excavating, they were trying to build a building in Luceno, this town, and they found bones. They found bones. So they found bones. So they right away went to the police. It looks like a murder. And they did carbon dating on these bones, and these bones are around for 1,000 years. So they decided that it's an ancient grave site. So they started digging. They found full tombs, Yiddish tombs with inscriptions in Hebrew. And this little mountain in Luceno is actually called Jew Mountain in Spanish. No one knew why it's called Jew Mountain. But now you know, because that's where they buried. Luceno is the town that outside the town, let's say a kilometer away, is the Beis HaKvaros. This Beis HaKvaros, according, there's a description from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the Kuzri, who describes the Levaya of his Rebbe, the Rimigosh. And he says, we went to the shul, the yeshiva. After this, we went to the right, we turned this way, we went here, we climbed a kilometer, and we buried him on this mountain. The Rimigosh is buried on that mountain. And he said, and the Yehuda Levi writes, that's the place the Rif is buried, and that's the place all the Rishonim that were all the Rosh Yeshivas in this yeshiva were buried in this place. They found this place. The mountain is maybe 300 feet by 300 feet. That's the whole thing. In this square area, you have Rishonim buried, and they excavated these things, and they put some of the tombs outside. You can't really read them; they're very hard to read, but you can see there's Hebrew letters in them. Interestingly, the Jews were very tall and very thin. It's a chiddush, by the way, because most of Eastern European Jews don't have that gene. But we should just know that we were once 1,000 years ago. We were thin and tall when we were in Spain. Somehow we got fakroch in the middle of in Eastern Europe. We shrunk. Okay, that's what happened. But originally the Jews are very healthy. That's obviously to be thin. Those are very healthy. So you have these the tombs are like over 6 feet. Like they're very long and very thin. But over there, obviously the Gabbai, what's the name? The guy that runs the Kfarim, already figured this out. You saw Gabbai, they're ready. Yeah, you saw my Gabbai. You can go there already. There's plaques, and you can make it. You can wash your hands. Someone's going to build a mikveh there. But the truth is, I think it's one of the greatest places in the world, because where else could you go daven by a rishon? Where in the world can you daven rishon? Now you're going to tell me the Rambam, and I got it. Lav Dafka, you know that, right? Lav Dafka, the Rambam was buried there. The Rambam was probably not buried there, but okay, Klal Yisrael was Makabel that the Rambam was buried there. The Ramban is in Eretz Yisrael, but there's two Kfarim of the Ramban in Eretz Yisrael. One is next to Archim al-Pela, so we don't really know exactly from Rishonim. Where? In Paskirs? In France? Okay, so there was a Beis Alman where in Germany. Maybe you know about this. That in Germany, that they said that Rashi and Talmidov and some of his children or grandchildren are buried in this cemetery in Worms. That doesn't. But the Messiah is that before the war they actually knew where the graves were. After the war it was bombed, so we actually don't know. Okay, so that's Be'erach. But the only other place where you go and you're davening in the vicinity of 200 feet, maybe you're standing mamash at that, or 200 feet of Rishonim, is this mountain. And the extra thing is, if you have a caver that people don't daven by, you can get a lot of things there because no one davens there. A million people come, everyone's schlepping things. Here, no one's schlepping. You come, you daven to the rif. He's there. Okay, fine. You're the only guy that's coming. I'm giving you.
Thanks for coming to the
Yeah, I'm telling you, I went there a few times. I'm telling you, it's kedai. Just come there. There's no one there. You can't even get it. You have to climb over the gate because no one's there. There's nothing there. Huh? It's a class trip. You go there. I'm telling you, it's kedai. Anyways, this is what happens at the beginning of. I forget. It's a schus for me that people go down by the Rif. By the Rif, gosh, I mean,
Rosh Hashanah?
Huh? Yeah, you can make Rosh Hashanah there. It's gewaldic. It's beautiful. It's on the mountains. This is where the Torah started in Spain. This is where Spanish. This is the whole Torah of Spain started in Andalus, in this part of Spain. And what happened is that the Gedolei Yisrael that the Rif and the Rimagash and these Chaver were producing were much greater than the Talmidim that were coming out of Babylon, out of the Goyim. And that's when the decline of the Goyim. That's when the Goyim finished. That Surim Pebedis, the end of that period of Bavel, was when Svard started producing such high levels of Torah learning that, first of all, the Jews in Spain, which was the major funders of the Babylonian Yeshivas, said, we're going to support our own local yeshivas. Why should we support we have the Rif, we have the real people there. And they started supporting their local yeshivas. The local yeshivas in Spain became the hot thing. And everyone came to learn there in the 1100s. And the Torah shifted. The Torah shifted from Babylon, shifted to Sfard. The interesting thing also, it's important, like in terms of like the Messiah of Teresh B'Peh, is that in the Go'onim, when the Go'onim learned Shas, it's a long conversation, because we don't really know when Chasimus HaShas is. So the Gemara we have, the Gemara says, the Ravina Ravashi is Soif Ha'irah. That's the end of Ha'irah. That's the end of Ha'irah. But what does the end of Ha'irah mean? Does that end means that they finished the Shas? Was there someone that actually wrote the Shas and said, Chasal? Like, how did it end? It's not so simple. With Pashtus, it didn't end so quickly. That's why you have Rabban Savroi, right? You have this time period where for hundreds of years, the Shas was almost ended, but wasn't fully finished. It wasn't like a complete document. Even Bizmana Goinim, which was right after that same period. Remember, the Goinim, if you're from the Goinim, let's say if you lived in the 800s, 200 years ago or 100 years ago, that was Shas. Right? That was Ravina Vashi. So all of a sudden, I'm no longer Shas. Like, who cut it off? It's very hard to, we have time periods like the Rishonim and the Achronim. Okay, but when exactly is the Beis Yosef a Rishon or Achron? The Maril, okay, exactly. All these people that lived in the in-between time period, it's very hard to say.
So who finishes Shas?
So the answer is we don't know. We don't know. It slowly ended, but what happened was that when the Go'onim look at Shas, they have a very different opinion about the way we understand Shas, and we understand Shas through Chacham Svar. They're not Chacham Ashkenaz, it's parallel. When the Go'onim looked at Shas, there's two things. First of all, there's the main sugyas in Shas. Let's say there's a sugya. Let's say people learning Avodah Zarah. Let's say, for example, yeah. So in the beginning of Avodah Zarah, the Gemara speaks about brachas. How you make a bracha? They have the makim shvach with this, right? The Gemara talks about like how do you make a bracha? How do you have first you have to say shvach, and then you say idah, right? That's the way a person should say a bracha. That really doesn't belong in Avodah Zarah. That's a law that belongs in brachas. That's Allah in brachas. But in Shas, you have a lot of times the Ikar Sugya, which is the main Sugya, and then you have a Sugya that appears in other Gemaras, like almost tangentially, like Derech Agav in another Gemara. When you want to paskin from Gemara, how do you paskin? In the Zman HaGoinim, if you ask a Shaila, because the people used to ask Shailas, that's Shuvas HaGoinim, right? What's Shuvas HaGoinim? Shuvas HaGoinim is that all the people lived outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside of Bavel. You lived in Spain. You need to know how to daven. What do you daven? You have a shul. What do you do? So you write to the Goinim. How do I daven? Who were the first people to write a siddur? Who were the first people to write a siddur? The Goinim. Why did the Goinim write a siddur? The first siddur that was written was Amram Gon. He's the first siddur that we have. It's a prototype of the siddur. Why did Amram Gon write a siddur? Because the Jews in Spain who were supporting him, right, his yeshiva, wrote to him a question. Says, okay, we get together, we read the Torah, we know Shemon Esrei, but what else do we do? Like, what's the discuss? So Amram Gon wrote for them what to do, which means in Bavel they didn't have to write a siddur because everyone knew that was, you grew up with it. That's you knew. But if you're living in Sfard, thousands of miles away, you didn't know. So Rabbi Amram Gon writes a siddur for Spanish Jewry, for Sfard. He writes it for the Sfardim. Rabbi Sadia Gon writes a siddur later. Same thing. They're writing for the Jews that live outside of Bavel.
Swag was the first.
Yes, it's not Nusach Sfard, it's Nusach Bavel. It's Hilchos Bavel that the Jews of Sfard adapted. So, in other words, okay, so everyone's writing to the Goyim to figure out what to do. So if a person has a question what to do, I don't know, could I klisheni, klishlishi? I don't know the halachas. What should I do? I don't know. I can't read the whole Gemara. What do I do? So you write to the Goyim. And the Goyim, the way they paskin, all the Goyim paskin this way. This is the way they ruled. They took the Ikar HaSugya, the main sugya in Shas, and they paskin from that main sugya. They didn't paskin from all Shas. They paskin from the sugya, from the main sugya. That's number one. Number two, there is a main sugya. What if brachas isn't brachas?
The first time it's mentioned.
No. The sugya where it is. Where's the main sugya? You're talking about Shabbos? It's in Hilchos Shabbos. You have to look in the Bar Shabbos. That's the sugya.
The fact that it's mentioned someplace else.
That's a chasr. If it's not a contradiction, adrabah, you can learn from it. But if it's a contradiction in the sugyas, okay. So we're not looking at we're looking at the ikar sugya. The second thing is how do you look at Agadata? Because the Gemara also has Agadata. What do you do with Agadata? So not all the Goyim, but there's a tshuva from Shmuel Chafni Goyin, who's from the Goyim. I think he's the shver of Shirya Goyin, who's the father of Haigon. It's all the same family. So he writes, we don't know what to do with it. You don't have to. You can ignore it. If you say there's an issue that Agadata would, I don't know. Just leave it alone. Don't get involved in it. The Chachmei Sfard, and this also parallel happened in Ashkenaz, and this is from Rashi. It's the same period. But we're not talking about Rashi. You know, the Kinos talks a lot about Rashi's period in the 1000s, which is the story of Spyro, which is the Crusade. In that time period, the people in Europe, the Yidden in Europe, both in Spain and in Ashkenaz, started learning Gemara differently. Which is, they did two things. First of all, there was no longer a possibility to say that this is the Ikar Sugya, this is the smaller Sugya. All Sugyas have to be linked. And if they don't link, figure it out. If you're learning one Gemara, and there's a steer in another Gemara, from another Gemara, which is not an Ikar Sugya, you have to figure out how that Gemara is not a steer. That's what Tosfos does, right? That's essentially what Tosfos is doing. He's trying to figure out what, right? Tosfos asks the question. Here we learn here you learn there. Then he's trying to figure out teretz. This whole idea is unified Torah Shabbat Peh, unified the Gemara. It made it into one body. This is number one. Number two is they also, and the Rambam is the first one to write this clearly from Sfard, is they look at the entire Shas as one thing, one body, and also because it's one body, Haggadah is part of Shas. It's not like you have to understand what Haggadah is, but you can't say I'm dismissing it. I'm not going to learn that. Okay, that's not negated to me. Haggadah has a place and a room within the understanding of the entire Torah Shabbat Peh, within the entire of Shas. This was an unofficial machloikus between the Chachmei Sfard and Ashkenaz with the Chachmei of Bavel. Because the Chachmei Bavel were still going with the old tradition of the Goinim, that we pass from the main sugya, and we're not in Torah Shabbat Peh, and Agadata. When the Rambam wrote his Yad HaChazaka, what the Rambam did this was on the highest level. What he did, he took the entire Torah Shabbat Peh that we have, right? Bavli and Yerushalmi and Tosefta and Medrash and Sifri, and he wrote this one body of Sefer and say, this is how we're going to paskin the halacha from all these sugyas, and I figured out how all these sugyas figured out, and this is going to be the halacha. When the Rambam wrote the Moira, his biggest opposition was from the Goinim. They were called Goinim, but that was the end. It was the end of the Goinim. From the Goinim that still lived in Bavel. And they wrote strong letters against the Rambam, saying, "A, who gave you permission to do this? You're the arbiter that decides which sugyas to do." Let me go back 20 years before this. The Rif. Why did the Rif write the Sefer? You know what the Rif is? You're familiar? I mean, I'm sure you're Bachar, you learn the Rif. The Rif only wrote on relevant sugyas. There's no Rif on Zvachim. There's no Rif on Menachas. There's Rif. The Rif wrote on the sugyas, on the Gemaras that were relevant. Right? You need to know Shabbos. The Rif wrote on Shabbos. The Rif is basically the first halachic sefer that was written. Other ones, the Bahagas before, but the first halachic sefer that was written in like Gemara, And it says, you need to pass. Let's say you're a Rav. You become a Dayan. Let's say you learn a Laseno. Let's use this in an energy. You learn by the Rif. And now you became a Rosh Yeshiva 300 miles away from the Rif in a small little town in Spain. And comes a guy asks you a shayla about the Chavez Basav Chalav or some Melicha, some question. You're not a Baki B'Shas. You're going to start going through the whole Shas and figuring out the whole sugya because it's one sugya. So you're going to figure out the whole thing. How do I pass? What do I do? So the Rif wrote a book called The Rif, which is called, it's like Cliff Notes. The Rif said, I'm going to do the job for you. I'm going to take the whole Gemara, condense it. The Rif is not big, right? If you take all the Rif, it's 200 pages, 300 pages. Take the whole Rif, not with the Ran or Mukhias. This is the Rif itself. It's at 300 pages. This little book you're going to hold, and if someone's going to ask you a question, they'll say brachas. You'll open to brachas. Shabbos, you'll turn to Shabbos, right? Very simple. But it's following the Shas. It's following the Gemara. If you want to know a din in Din Mamonis, you have to go to Bava Basra, but you have to follow it. So that was the first sefer. The Rif became so popular, by the way, that there were yeshivas that didn't learn Gemara. They only learn Rif. That's why if you look at Svarim, you'll see the Nebuchadnezzar Yosef, the Ran. They're not just like little commentaries on the Rif. It's not like the Mishnah L'Melech on the Rambam. This is like a full Tosfos on the Rif. The answer is because that's what they learned. They didn't learn Gemara. If maybe some guys learn Gemara because those are the more advanced guys. But if you're a regular bacher and you want to go out there was no Shulchan Aruch, remember? So you need to know what to do. So you're a bacher that was an average head, and you weren't able to learn the whole Gemara. So they said, okay, let's learn Rif. So when you come out of yeshiva, you know what to do. And then the Ran was Rosh Yeshiva that gave you a shir. He gave a shir on the Rif. And he explained you what the Rif means. They gave you all the pilpul of the Rif. And the Mukha Yosef, they're all Svardim, right? They're all Svardish Rabbanim that gave Purushim on the Rif. Because in Svard, a lot of people actually learned the Rif. They didn't learn Gemara even. The Rambam did this 10 times more. Because what the Rambam did was, first, he didn't go according to the Gemara. He did his own version, right? There was no bracha, Shabbos. He did his own version. He made it also systematic. If you want to know a halacha of Shabbos, you don't have to learn the whole Gemara Shabbos. Because in the Rif, if they ask you a halacha of Shabbos, it can be a halacha of Eitzah Shabbos, it can be a Bishul of Shabbos. You have to read through the whole Rif to figure out. The Rambam, there's one Perek that deals with, Perek Lamed deals with Havdalah, and Perek Chavtes deals with Kiddush, so you know exactly where to look up. So it's very systematic. He created one Torah. The Go'onim of Bavel had a hard time with the Rambam, so they gave him a lot of, and they told him, you're writing without Mar Mekoimus. Rambam doesn't write Mar Mekoimus. It doesn't say where you're taking it from. Where's the source? And you're speaking like a very high level. You're the arbiter. You're going to say the halacha. The Rambam, was hurt by this, but for a while, this is kind of interesting. The Rambam was a little hurt, but then there were Jews, and this is another part of history, where in that same time period, that was happening in Spain, in Andalus, which is the south of Spain. In that same time, in northern France, there started to be a revealing of Torah Shalapels, a very strong presence of learning. So originally it was in Germany. That's where Rashi comes from, in the Rhine. That's where it starts. But then it ends what we call, if you look in the earlier Rishonim, it talks Provence. Right? Chachme Provence. Provence, it's not a real place. We call it Provence. Provence is like what's there today in there, and you're not going to know anything today. Montpellier, Pasquiers, you ever heard of these towns? Okay, so these are little towns in the south, in the northern part of Spain. Cannes and what's the other thing? In France, in Nice, yeah, in France. I'm sorry, France, correct. Southern France. That part of France, yes, in the French Riviera, in the water, which is very close to Spain. It's only it's 100 miles away from Spain. That part of France started having very strong Torah, very strong. It was very small communities, not Nice, further close. No, little tiny towns, even further, but near there. Little tiny towns, there lived maybe 100 Yidden there, but they had strong yeshivas, very strong yeshivas. Lunil, ever hear Chachma Lunil? There's one of the Balei Toisa, Yonasim Lunil. Comes to Lunil. That's a little tiny town. It's like a hole in the wall. Paskirs, a small little town. The Ravid was the Rav of the Rosh Yeshiva in Paskirs. They had yeshivas, and Montpellier, the Chachmei Ahar, the Meir brings down the Chachmei Ahar. These are the Chazal, the Rishonim that lived there. These Yidden that lived in this little area loved the Rambam, and the Rambam has many tshuvas to Chachmei L'Nil, and he writes to the Chachmei L'Nil, and he says that finally I see that the Torah is not going to be nishtakach. The Torah is not going to end, because I thought that after Spain, because Rambam had to finish Spain, after Spain, the south of Spain was closed because the Amaleks, whatever, there's these Muslims came and conquered that part of the land, so everything closed. That whole area closed. So he said, I thought the Torah is going to be lost. Now that I see that there are Yidden that know how to learn in Chachmei L'Nil, he says, thank God there's such Yidden that are alive. And the Ravid, who is the biggest antagonist, the person that wrote the most on the Rambam, who is the biggest, one of the big Gedolei Yisrael at that time, even though he argues with the Rambam, but the fact that he wrote on the Rambam means that 99% of the time he agrees with the Rambam. It's just the 2% that he doesn't, which is also a big stempel. That means that the Rambam was a very correct explanation of Torah, and that's how the Rambam became accepted. This how do I get into this? So this whole thing of the Torah Sheba'al Peh is that once it was the Chesimus HaShas, and the Torah moved then either into Spain or into Germany. In Germany, there was, just like there are Balei HaTosfos, Balei HaTosfos is all descendants of Rashi. The Balei HaTosfos, they're French Balei HaTosfos, and there's the German Balei HaTosfos. Most Balei HaTosfos that we know are the French Balei HaTosfos. The Rashbam, Rabbeinu Tam, the Ri, these are the famous ones that are all French Balei HaTosfos. There was also, and most of the Balei HaTosfos, and most of the known Balei HaTosfos are from France. There was also a huge group of Balei HaTosfos that lived in Germany. Reb Simcha Spiro was one of the Balei HaTosfos. The Rebbe of Shibbolei Aleket. There was a many big Balei HaTosfos that lived in Germany, and the reason why we don't know them, most people don't know the Balei HaTosfos from them, is because of the event that happened with the First Crusade. That there were 3 little towns in Germany that's called Shum, Spiro, Magenza, and Spiro, Magenza, and no, what's the third one? Shum, Vermeisa. Yeah, these 3 little towns. You can go visit them. They're small little towns. They were the main dominant places. They had big yeshivas there. Big again. There was a few hundred bachrim in these yeshivas. That's where there were Balei HaTosfos of Germany. And during the time by the time of the Crusade, which was in the late 1000s, the First Crusade, Yidden were massacred in all these towns, terribly. Rebbe Lezer of Germaiza, the Balei Rekeach, who was an Edom of Yehuda HaChassid, Sefer Chassidim, so Lezer Rekeach, one of the big Rishonim, his wife and his children were massacred in front of his eyes. And he writes about this, and he writes that the experiences. This is one of the Kinos that we have, that we say in Amarti Shua ben Bebechi Amarer, on page 45, is about the massacres that happened in Spiro, against these events. And because of that, we lost the Tosfos. In other words, the Balei HaTosfos, they wrote, and where did they keep their manuscripts? In the shuls. They kept it where, that's what they kept. But these Rotzchim, when they came, they burnt down the shuls, they burnt down everything. So we lost that whole Messiah, we have very little from some of the Rishonim that, the Oizarua, some of the Rishonim that actually went and learned by the Balei HaTosfos in Germany, brought over some of the Torah that we have that survived. But most of the Torah that exists, besides, like say for Chassidim Rekeach, which was different, they different type of farm, from the actually Balei HaTosfos, we lost in Germany.
We talked about Spain, the rift.
Yeah.
They all spread out to Germany.
No, so that's parallel. No, it's not. It's a separate thing that happened. Separate thing that happened. This happens. Yeah, it's complicated how this happened, but it's a separate mahalach. It's a separate mahalach. It really goes back to Rabbeinu Hananel. But this is separate. There's a separate thing. the people are learning Gemara Avodah Zarah today. So if you're familiar, if you ever learn Tosas and Avodah Zarah, you'll see that Tosas and Avodah Zarah is not like the Tosas that you have in any other Shas. For example, I'll give you a few examples. One thing, the Tosas and Avodah Zarah sometimes explains things. It's pshat. It's like a Rashi. You don't have that in any Tosas. It gives pshat. Nedarim is like that also, but Nedarim is not Tosas or Rashi. It's a whole other Tosas. But okay, but these are not Balei HaTosas. I'm talking about the Tosas of Bombas, and the regular big Balei HaTosas don't explain. They're not Pirushim. They're not giving explanations. They're asking questions why things are like this. The other thing is there's one of the Balei HaTosas that's not mentioned any other Tosas. Is Rabbeinu Elchanan. Kamat, if you look in Tosas and Avodah Zarah, almost every page has a Tosas of Rabbeinu Elchanan. Another thing is, it paskins. Constantly. It says the halacha will be like this. It's machlekes like this. This is where you have to paskin. Tosas doesn't do that. Tosas is not a psak. Tosas doesn't write psakim. Tosas gives the ideas. He's not writing halacha. The halacha kamar. Tosas doesn't do it. This was written by Reb Shmuel Palaiza. This Tosas. Reb Shmuel Palaiza is a very important person to us. So some of us that know him, because he's one of the great Balei HaTosas, and one of his Einiklach is very close to us. But Reb Shmuel Palaiza is French. A French Balei HaTosas, and Reb Shmuel Palaiza learned by Rabbi Chila Paris. So there was the French Balei HaTosas that lived in Provence, and then there was also the French Balei HaTosas that lived in Paris. Paris, I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. Paris was once a thriving Jewish community. Years ago, this is one of the Kinos is about the burning of the Gemaras, right? That they burned 24 wagons of Gemaras. They burned 24 wagons of Gemaras is at the time of Rabbi Chila in Paris. Rabbi Chila in Paris was a great Rishon. He's the Shver of Maram Rottenburg. The Maram Rottenburg is German. He's from Rottenburg, right? Maram Rottenburg. They just found, I just saw this like a few weeks ago, they found his yeshiva in Germany, in Rottenburg, where the Rush learned. Have you heard about this? They found the in Rottenburg, they found in Königsberg, and so one of these little towns, you heard about this? Anyone heard about this? They found the yeshiva of Maram Rottenburg. It's fascinating. We actually have two, side note, they have the yeshiva in Rouen of the Rashbam, the full yeshiva. There's a structure. The Rashbam had a yeshiva in Rouen, in France. They were doing excavation, there was a sinkhole, like 40 years ago. There was a sinkhole in the middle of the town. It opened up, and when they opened it up, they found the entire structure, a full building, of the Rashbam's yeshiva. You can actually, the French are anti-Semitic, so you can't visit it, but maybe you have some connections. You try to get so you can actually go visit the Rashbam's yeshiva. The Even Ezra writes that he was in the Rashbam's yeshiva. He explains how it looks. It's exactly how it looks. There's 2 floors that they have exactly the Arnon, where the Bacham sat. This is another yeshiva, the Ram Rottenburg. The Ram Rottenburg, Shver is Rechil in Paris. His Shver was Rechil in Paris. He debated, when they wanted to burn the Gemaras, he was one of Shmuel Palaiza, Rechil Paris of Paris, went to debate to defend the Gemaras. Unfortunately, it was a meshumad, like all the stories. Nicholas Dunham, a terrible person, a yeshiva bacha, the shmad, and knew Gemara and argued in front of the king that the Gemaras are terrible, and they burned the Gemaras, 24 Gemaras. The reason why it was such a devastating event is because that was the end of French Jewry, because once the Gemaras were burned, there was no way to learn. The yeshivas had to close. They only had Gemaras, right? You had a Gemara, you copied it by hand. You burned the Gemaras, there's no yeshiva. So that was because Notre Dame, because the Maram Rottenburg, the rights that Allah Be'esh, that eventually there's going to be a Churban Be'esh also for the people that burned the Gemaras, they can also burn. So then when it burnt down, they said that was the curse of Maram Rottenburg. But that was the end of French Jewry the way we know it. And then the anti-Semites eventually kicked the Jews out of Paris. And the reason why they kicked the Jews out of Paris, you should know this, wherever you go to Paris, because the Jews owned Paris. The Jews were good with money, and they loaned a lot of money to the other people. We don't have to say who they are. And they owned a lot of money. And it came with a situation that the whole Paris was basically collateral for Jews. So what do you do? What do you do if the whole city is owned by Jews? You kick the Jews out, L'Shalom Yisrael. And that's exactly what they did. And that was, and, huh?
Didn't they stay in the south? The front?
No. The Jews are kicked out of entire France. In the late 1200s, there's no Jews. There's no Jews in the. There's nothing changed. In the 1500s, there's no Jews in France anymore. I mean, a very small pocket of Jews. And then the Jews, the way the Jews came back into France was the Marranos. In the 1600s, they let Marranos come into France because the Marranos came as Christians. They didn't come as Jews. But eventually they became Jews, and that's how Jews became back into France. Anyways. That's what I'm saying.
What was the blind Nevi'im? What did Elam do every day? What happened?
Yeah, that's like a child. We don't know.
He just came the way we know it.
It was a different, yeah.